Chapter 17 of Hopes, Part 2. A few seconds passed. Rainbow had been expecting to hear the soft click of Gerrit's talons against the metal floor as he walked away, but she was surprised to hear him coming closer. Is he right about a griffin taking your eye? A shiver passed through her. Her jaw worked side to side. Yeah. There was a long silence between them, and when Gerrit spoke, she could hear the sincerity in his voice. I'm sorry to hear that. He paused, and she could feel his eyes on the back of her head. It must have been hard for you, fighting me. A choked laugh escaped her.
It was like a dream. Until it wasn't.
She risked a glance in his direction, the corner of her lip pulling up into a tentative grin.
I've had a lot of practice since the last time I fought a griffin.
He grinned back at her. It shows.
Is it true what he said?
She asked, nodding towards the now vacant balcony.
About you killing his last bodyguard?
He nodded. I was hired by a competitor to assassinate him. His last bodyguard was a Pegasus too, actually. His eyes flicked up towards her mane for a brief moment, though not quite like you. Her grin grew a little wider, and she turned to face him fully.
I'm sorry about snapping earlier, when you asked about my mane. I get it a lot is all.
No, I understand. It can be annoying, hearing the same questions everywhere you go.
So if you were hired to assassinate him, Rainbow began, how did you end up as his bodyguard?
Gerrit shrugged, wincing. It was pretty clear that he was far wealthier than my old employer, so I gave him some time to make me an offer. It was a pretty good offer. Rainbow frowned.
So, you betrayed him?
Now it was Gerrit's turn to let out a sharp laugh. You must be younger than you look. People like us, gifted, griffins, all the little toys that the rich banter and scrap over. We can't betray them any more than a bit can betray its spender. Do you think my last employer cared about me any more than Silverblood does? He shook his head. They bind you with paper. Our paper is better than the deals the rabble at the bottom get, but it's still paper.
So, leave.
Rainbow gestured away with a huff.
Fly off. Be free.
He shot her a lopsided smile. You want to sit? He padded off to the nearest bench, the same one that Rainbow and Saber had been sitting on before. After a brief hesitation, she followed, and the two sat facing each other on opposite ends. I'll tell you a story, Gerrit began. It's a story most gifted go through, and one I went through as well when I was younger. He paused, his expression going distant. People like us. We're told the world will be ours one day. So you go out there and someone offers you a job, a good job. Every street or hall is full of exhausted workers in ragged clothes scrambling to find the time to feed themselves. And you're offered a job that pays more than they'll ever see, given a home for yourself larger than a whole family's, and promised a trip that'll take you all around the world. All you have to do is sign the contract. He shrugged. So you do. Time passes, and the job doesn't seem so good anymore for one reason or another. You realize that nobody cares about you. That you're just a tool, And everywhere you go, you're offered better jobs, better deals. If you break the contract, your old employer will put a bounty on your head, but if you sign a new one, your new employer can protect you. Maybe you take it, maybe you don't. His expression grew hard, and his voice bitter. Maybe you're given a choice. Break the contract or die. However it happens, there's a bounty on your head. And all these merchants and their sacks of gold, they have rules that they play by to keep it fair. He spat the word as if it was poison. Hunting bounties that are contracted under someone is considered rude, so you always need a contract. And the only way to get out of a contract without wasting half your life on it is to break it. So the bounty gets bigger, and the paper chains get tighter.
Oh, can't you hide? Rainbow asked. Or fight if you have to?
Spend my life living like a rat when I could be living here with my own room, ponies jumping to obey me, and all I have to do is look menacing? Gerrit snorted, shaking his head. No, I'm content here. Once you've been in the game long enough, it doesn't really bother you anymore, you know? No, maybe someday I'll jump ship and find a new job, and Silverblood will put another 1,000 bits on my head. But as long as I'm with someone that plays fair, as far as the merchants see it, no hunters will come for me.
But it's not fair.
Rainbow stomped a huff.
How do these ponies get away with it? Why doesn't someone do something?
Oh, they all get what they deserve in the end. Gerrit smirked, meeting her gaze. Eventually, they cross the wrong pony, whether it be a competitor, an employee, or just some wild card passing through. Someone they can't buy off or scare with the threat of bounties. Or maybe they get greedy, break their rules, and their peers tear them apart like vultures. He raised a talon to his chin thoughtfully. I don't think I've ever heard of these ponies dying peacefully in their sleep. Well, that's the trade-off, I guess. We get good deaths, and they get good lives. They lapsed into a companionable silence, each one lost in their own thoughts. After several minutes, Rainbow stood.
I'm gonna hit the showers,
she said. She looked back, offering up a tentative smile.
Sorry about the bruises, Gerrit. I'm glad we got to know each other a bit.
He dipped his head, returning the smile. Same here, Rainbow. Wherever the griffin that did that to you is, I hope he gets what's coming to him.
Yeah.
She turned away, waving with one wing.
She will.
If only the Bluecoats weren't so obsessed with always moving in pairs, Anna's life would be a lot easier. The sun was setting for the second time since she had entered the valley, and she had spent the entire day burrowed into the core of a pile of hay, barely moving. The individual strands clung to her, itching and poking and tickling at her nose, and often she'd have to wait entire minutes for a patrol to pass by before she could scratch. On the bright side, it was edible. Dry, but edible. She chewed at a glacial pace, grinding the hay down between her molars, and watched. Nettlekiss's keep was built on top of a slight rise in the land, and a wide radius around it was kept clear of trees. These were precautions taken against potential sieging armies as much as potential infiltrators like herself, and it made things complicated. She had hoped to find an unwary soldier wandering out on their own, take them down, and steal their uniform. A peasant might be stopped for approaching the castle or even just strolling the valley without good purpose, but a soldier with enough urgency in her step could get many places on confidence alone. Unfortunately, the Bluecoats never did anything alone. The troops Friesland had sent to Nettlekiss were veterans, and they knew better than to go traipse about a siege without a friend to watch their back. Even if they weren't concerned for spies or ambushes, it was all too easy to fall in an old foxhole or trigger a trap and be forgotten about. And conversation made the time pass quicker. As for Nettlekiss's own troops, they were nowhere to be seen. They were either on the front or within the keep itself, out of sight and out of reach. So she watched, nestled under her blanket of hay, sheltered from the wet chill of the rain drizzling down. Movement caught her eye. She shifted, honing in on the green-uniformed stallion galloping towards the keep from the trees to the northwest. An undecorated messenger bag bounced at his side as he skidded up to an older Friesland soldier that had been leaning against a well, smoking pipe tucked between his lips. There was a brief, hurried exchange of words, and the older soldier replaced his pipe with a whistle. The shrill shriek of the whistle rang out over the keep, summoning bluecoats from seemingly every nook and cranny. Within 5 minutes, 100 deadly Frieslanders were marching west along the road. Anna narrowed her eyes. If they were going west, following the well-trodden road that ran up the spine of the valley instead of immediately sprinting north or south, it meant they had a ways to go. There was a shout from a sergeant, and the column sped into a trot. She couldn't see the sun from any of the little peepholes she had made in the hay, but she had a good sense of time. It would be dark within a half hour at most, and based on her previous observations, the garrison would be gone for at least 4 times that length, probably longer. That meant she would have 90 minutes to get in, find the seal, and get back out unseen. Or she could go now, when the reserves had just left and the garrison was still reacting to the commotion, and give herself some more time. She scanned the field before her and the wall of the keep itself, searching for watchful eyes. There was no way she could be absolutely certain that there weren't any sentries looking in her direction, and it would be impossible for even her to cross the field without being spotted. No, she would wait. She would take her time like she always did, and she would finish the job with minimal theatrics or fuss. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, she moved. It was a bright night, with the moon and stars bathing the fields surrounding the keep in pale silver. So she waited for a cloud to pass overhead before crossing, using its shadow for cover. Her ears swiveled and twitched at every sound as she crept through the open, moving with the rhythm of the swaying grass. She paused to assess her situation as she reached the base of the keep. There were no windows close to the ground, and attempting entry through the gate would be suicide. But it was unlikely any sentries would be staring straight down the walls from above. She waited for another cloud to pass over, before beginning her climb. The stones were fit loosely together, giving her ample supply of small ledges and cracks to heft herself up with her hooves and wing claws. It only took her a few minutes to reach the lowest windows, but she passed them over. Sneaking into the first window you came across was a rookie mistake. The window was a tight fit, caught halfway between the need for good ventilation and the need to protect any soldiers firing from within, but Anna made it through with a minimal struggle. She let out a breath of relief as her hooves touched down on cold stone. The hard part, she hoped, was over. She was in a hallway that ran all around the edges of the keep, with doors along the inner edge leading deeper inside and pillars of moonlight blooming past the windows opposite. The hall was dark and silent, with the reserves out on the front. There would be only servants, a small garrison, and perhaps Nettlekiss herself left to guard it. The question, then, was where she could find the seal she needed. She flapped her wings, inverting herself and using the little claws at the ends for purchase as she crawled along the ceiling beams. She had a lot of ground to cover. Ready to depart, my lady? Pontius gave Rarity a smile, his good mood clearly visible. She returned the smile, extending a hoof for him.
Certainly, darling.
They were in the hall between their two rooms, each dressed and ready to go for a night at the Commoners Guild meeting. Rarity wore a relatively simple dress, her burgundy cloak over a lighter red blouse with a white scarf wrapped around her shoulders for warmth. Pontius, as usual, wore an orange tunic beneath his polished breastplate, with a brown cloak hanging from his shoulders. Whitehorn's voice called out from his room. "Are you two leaving already?"
We are.
Rarity poked her head inside to see him seated in front of his makeshift desk, polishing his glasses with a small cloth.
We should be back for dinner, but don't wait up on our part.
He shot her a quick smile. "Fair warning, I've been busy on my end. I won't be there to see it, but I'd appreciate hearing how it all goes upon your return." Rarity cocked her head.
Busy with what, precisely?
"Oh, you'll see." He waved with one hoof as he slid his glasses back over his eyes. "I trust you'll be able to handle it, Countess." Rarity pursed her lips, but there wouldn't be time to press him for more info. Whatever it was, she'd have to witness it herself. After taking a moment to bid goodbye to Pinky and Piaf, who seemed occupied with some sort of drinking game in the common room, Rarity and Pontius stepped out into the street. A pair of bluecoats fell in behind them as they started on their way, but Rarity paid them little mind. After so long in the city, the ever-present soldiers trailing her every step were only slightly more unsettling than the occasional thunder of cannon fire from the walls. It was the day after her discussion with Whitehorn concerning his writings, and to make up for her poor treatment of Pontius, she had offered to take him with her to the guild meeting in Pinky's stead. He had accepted eagerly, and had been in a good mood all day. A small smile graced Rarity's lips as she watched him striding confidently beside her, head held high as if to challenge any who might think he didn't belong there. It was a far cry from the uncertain young stallion who'd first gawked at her upon entering his father's dining room, or the frustrated noble brooding in Piaf's household since they entered the city, and she quite approved of the transformation. If only she'd shown him some trust sooner, perhaps she would have spared him some anguish. Winter was hitting its stride as they passed through the city. The sun still hadn't quite set yet, but the streets were already all but empty, and every citizen had some cloak or coat or similar attire to hold back the wind. The vapor from Rarity's breath made small puffs of white in the air, and after a few minutes out in the open, she could feel the tip of her nose going numb as the chill settled into place. Even the town criers seemed diminished by the weather. Instead of crowing their news from the tops of stacked boxes, they called it out from the shelter of storefronts or awnings, their voices hoarse from the dry air. The Commoners Guild was surprisingly full when they arrived. When it was so cold out, minor grievances weren't worth the walk to raise them, and so it was usually only the most diligent or vindictive petitioners that would come, but nearly every seat was taken. Rarity led Pontius to their usual table, where Riverpie and Twinklesmith were chattering urgently.
Did you hear, Countess?
Riverpie asked.
About the Guildmaster.
Rarity arched a brow as she sat, casting her gaze around the room. She caught a few eyes looking back in her direction, but that wasn't unusual for her.
I'm afraid not, darling. What's all this commotion about?
He's a no-good traitor is what he is, Twinklesmith hissed. He pulled a trio of broadsheets out of his vest and slapped them onto the table. Can't believe I ever trusted him. Rarity frowned down at the sheets curiously. The headlines jumped out at her, grabbing her attention with bold, blocky letters. Commoners Guild on the take, one said, and the next, cart marks exposed. A reliable, anonymous source from within the Commoners Guild administration came to the Friesland Trotter's office yesterday with written correspondence between Mr. Cart Marks, master of the Commoners Guild, and several other prominent guilds within Friesland. The letters portray Mr. Marks as a business pony, accepting payment from managers and owners across the city to make complaints disappear. Rarity skimmed the rest of the text, her eyes growing wider with every sentence.
Is this what Whitehorn was talking about? He's been working against you all this time?
Lying to our faces he has, Twinkle spat. All this nonsense about choosing our battles. Pah! Every victory we've ever had has been given to us. And we've taken it without complaint like stray dogs happy to get scraps off a table.
Well, what are we going to do?
Rarity asked. There was a tangible energy filling the room, being driven ever higher with every new pony that stepped in from the street.
Oh, goodness, it feels like the room could explode at any moment.
He should be deposed, Pontius said, shaking his head in disdain. This behavior is unacceptable for any lord.
He ain't no lord, and I'll be sure to remind him of it,
River Pie said, thumping a hoof against the table for emphasis.
Soon as he finds the courage to come down from that office of his, that is.
Twinkle snorted. I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to slip out the window. There was a sudden uproar from the room, and Rarity looked up to see Mr. Marks descending the steps. His face was grim, his movements stiff as he climbed up into his seat behind the bar. And he had two bluecoats walking on either side of him, the bayonets on their rifles like flags waving overhead with every step. Howls of accusation came from the assembled ponies, followed by thrown mugs and rotten vegetables. Order! Order! Mr. Marks thumped his hoof against the stone of the bar, ducking an old tomato aimed straight for his head. Oh, shut up, you rabble! Traitor!
Get out of that seat!
Leave this place before we throw you out ourselves! The jeers came from every direction, and a couple ponies even rose from their tables and tried to approach him, only to be roughly shoved back by the guarding bluecoats. Mr. Marks stood up, shouting to be heard over the commotion. I will not vacate the office I've worked so hard to obtain over the baseless accusations you've read in your favorite broadsheets! Twinklesmith shot out of his chair. We demand a vote of no confidence! Sit down, Mr. Smith! Mr. Marks shouted. Governor Rea declared a state of emergency the very day the siege started, and there will be no votes until this crisis has passed. A chorus of boos rose from the crowd, and more ponies surged forth to be pushed back by the bluecoats. The sergeant barked an order, and after a brief hesitation, the soldiers swung their rifles down into firing position, leveling them on the room. It's not safe here. Pontius leaned over to be heard in Rarity's ear. Blood will be shed.
Surely Mr. Marks wouldn't order the troops to fire on civilians.
Rarity looked nervously between each of the soldiers, watching their expressions. The sergeant seemed unshaken, but the other three were visibly nervous.
There would be a riot!
Despite her words, Rarity could tell that there was disaster approaching. More and more commoners were getting out of their seats, stomping their hooves and calling for the disgraced guildmaster's resignation, and he shouted back his denials and refusals. The bluecoat sergeant ducked as a mug was thrown from him, the clay shattering against the guild council's bar and spraying drink over the soldiers. She could see it clearly in her head. A soldier would fire, either out of nerves or in reaction to whichever pony was bold and mad enough to attack directly, and the room would collapse into chaos. There had to be dozens of ponies facing down the four troops, even if the two bluecoats that had come as Rarity's escort were to involve themselves. They wouldn't stand a chance. Mr. Marks, perhaps the entire council would be dragged from their seats and beaten to death by the furious crowd. Is this what Whitehorn had wanted? It must have been him that had circulated the incriminating evidence to the broadsheets, though she couldn't imagine how he might have obtained it. Surely this kind of bloodshed was the very thing he wanted to avoid. She thought back to what he had said before she left. I trust you'll be able to handle it, Countess. Before she knew it, she was standing up.
Stop! Stop this!
There was no reaction. She could barely hear herself over the crowd, so how could she expect them to hear her? With a frustrated groan, she shoved her way to the front of the room, flicking her mane disdainfully at one of the soldiers as he leveled his bayonet towards her, and turned to face the crowd.
Listen to me!
She shouted.
Please!
There was a brief dip in the clamor as the ponies near the front paused in their jeering to look her way. Rarity opened her mouth to take advantage of the break, but was cut off by Mr. Marks. "Return to your seat, Countess!" he barked. "This is a Friesland affair!" That caught their attention. She had just been another unfamiliar mare when she stepped to the front, but now she was an unfamiliar mare that the guildmaster didn't want to speak. More eyes turned to her, but there was still some commotion towards the back. River Pie came up to her side.
Quiet! Let us speak!
Twinkle Smith, still standing near their table, eyed Rarity suspiciously. "Why should we trust her? She's one of them."
Twinkle!
River snapped.
She ain't the one that took your horn from you, eh? She's the one that worked us up to exhaustion after that bombing, before you even showed up. So pull your head out of your plot hole and let's help her help us.
He flinched back at the steel in her voice, and some of the fire seemed to leave him. More and more ponies began to quiet, and Rarity suddenly found herself the subject of many curious and suspicious gazes. She gulped, adjusting her mane and scarf with her hooves. Pontius came up to her side, keeping his voice low so only she could hear. "Calm yourself. This is what you wanted, eh?"
Yes,
Rarity whispered back.
though I had been hoping for a situation with somewhat less imminent violence.
"Fret not, my lady," Pontius said. "I shall fight every pony in this room if I must to see you to safety."
Oh,
Rarity let out a breathy titter.
well, that's a pleasant thought, isn't it?
Soon, all eyes were on her. The outraged yelling had diminished into suppressed grumbles and venomous glances towards the guild council. The air was thick with expectation. "What's this, then?" Mr. Marks asked from his seat. "Have you all finally seen reason? Can we finally get this meeting started?" Rarity glanced up at him. He was frowning down at her with obvious contempt, regarding her as he might to a pile of garbage he'd stepped in on the side of the road. She looked away, turning her attention back to the crowd. He wasn't the one she needed to speak to, after all.
Some of you may not know me.
She began, raising her voice to be heard clearly.
My name is Rarity, and I came to the city only recently, hoping to prevent a bloody war. Clearly, I've already failed in some respect on that matter, but I hope we can avoid any violence here today.
"We know you!" a stallion called from the crowd. "You're the Baron mare that's been spying on us!"
Shut it, you idiot!
Another voice countered.
That's Countess Rarity! She saved my cousin's life on Phyllis!
And she cleaned my brother's wounds at Old Westfort,
a mare added. A few approving stomps rose up from the crowd, quieting the heckler, and a warmth welled in Rarity's heart.
This pony,
she nodded her head back towards where Mr. Marks was seated,
has betrayed you all. He has lied to you, used you for his personal gain, and callously ignored your pain. But you do not need him.
"This is your last warning," Mr. Marks growled. "Return to your seat or you'll be spending tonight in a dungeon." She ignored him. She couldn't stop now, not when she had the whole room hanging on her words.
He is not the one who's helped you in times of need. He is not the one who saw to the wounded at Old Westfort, the one who carried the cranes that allowed you to clear the rubble from the roads, or the one who laid the stones to fill the craters left behind. That was you!
Her heart pounded as she cast her gaze over the crowd, seeing nods of approval reflected back at her.
You are the ones that hold the power.
Arrest that mare! Mr. Marks bellowed. She glanced back to see him leaning over to push the soldiers into action. She's a foreign agent and she has no right to speak here! The soldiers looked to their sergeant for approval, and he stepped forwards. Pontius silently positioned himself between him and Rarity, and a trio of thick-bodied commoners rose from the crowd to join him.
You don't need any guild's approval to help each other,
she continued.
All we need to do is be friends to each other, to help each other when it's needed, no matter what the guild masters say. There's no need to call for this pony's blood for his abuse of power, because he doesn't have any power.
She's right. A stallion stood up near the back of the room. If the city won't help us, then we won't help it. I say we strike and buck what the guild says. A second passed, and then another pony stood up. Strike! Strike! More rose to take up the chant, and soon ponies were pouring out into the street, stopping only to kick over tables or jeer at the gaping guild council. Rarity's legs went weak, and she fell back onto her haunches with a gasp of relief. She'd done it. It wasn't a war by any means, but she'd stopped some bloodshed. Shoot her, you idiots! Mr. Marks clambered down from his seat and limped over to the nearest soldier, pointing her rifle at Rarity and the pony standing protectively in front of her with his own hooves. Fire! Fire! Hold! Fire! The sergeant barked, stepping in the way. Mr. Marks shot him a look of furious disbelief, but the sergeant held firm. They're civilians, sir.
Pontius, dear?
Rarity said, horn glowing as she tugged on his cloak.
I do believe we should get going.
Aye. Pontius nodded. That would seem wise.
Go, go!
River Pie shooed them away.
We'll hold them up. Good luck, Countess. Oh, thank you, darling. Until next time.
They rushed out of the guild hall at a brisk pace, the doors hanging limply on their hinges after the passage of a particularly brutish guild member. Their two escorts were standing outside with the confusion clear on their faces, but they seemed to relax as they saw Rarity and Pontius emerging from the room unscathed.
We're just heading back early, dears,
Rarity said, offering up a thin smile.
Urgent matter. Nearly forgot. Come along now.
Together, the two of them ran up the street, their confused escorts following behind just as the first motes of snow began to fall.